Grüß, willkommen in einem aufregendes video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 33 of my figure gaming video series. In this video I'll discuss how to create movement trays for the Blücher Napoleonic rules. The Blücher rules, written by Sam Mustafa, are an interesting attempt at creating a quick play set of rules which can reproduce an entire battle, although it does this in a rather abstract manner. I like these rules, although they're not my favourite Napoleonic rules. They do offer players a quick game with minimal setup, play and pack-up time required. As a result, they do fit or fill an important niche. The key element of the game is its card-based units. Instead of using figures, players could simply purchase the cards, each of which represents a formation in the rules. In this case, we see a line infantry formation and a cavalry formation. One benefit of this system is players could create their own cards, as shown here. While you can create your own high-quality cards, these lower-quality cards are perfectly functional as well. Each card has a reasonable amount of information printed on it, which makes play easier. It's basically a larger board game counter with all the advantages and disadvantages of a board game. Most of these values are fixed, and a player would have the card off the table to act as a sort of cheat sheet. The variable value is elan, or for artillery, ammo boxes. Any movement trays require a player has some way of tracking these variable values. This shows an example of what a game may look like if you're just using the cards. While the card system offers many benefits, I prefer figures, thus my interest in creating a movement tray to make play as close to the card version as possible while retaining the figure gaming bling, for want of a better word. This shows one possible example of what I consider rather good-looking movement trays. In this case, the movement trays are a similar size to the original cards, which are playing card size. You'll notice the figures are using the US style of basing, and up to 4 elements are placed on each movement tray. The critical point is the use of a dice to track elan. This will cover 95% of all your formations, but some formations have an elan of 7, which requires a special method of tracking it. I'd suggest no dice indicates it has an elan of 7, or perhaps under the dice there is a 7. The formation is indicated as well. This is required because players will need to cross-reference the other fixed values of the formation. In this example, we have a movement tray which has no embedded values included on the tray. Instead, a piece of paper with the values is placed directly behind the movement tray. This is an interesting solution. In this case, the entire base is card sized with a special strip which is placed behind it. This contains the values as well as room for the dice. In this example, the movement trays have no slots and is a simple 3mm MDF board with a slot at the rear for a dice. The elements are simply placed on the tray. In this example, we see a rather elaborate base. It's a simple element with a strip at the rear which contains the values and a spot for the dice. I think this is all one piece, which means it could only be used with this set of rules. Here is another single base approach, which I have to admit does look rather nice. Now we come to a comparatively significant issue. If you are using figures, are you going to base them for these rules only, or are you going to use a more universal based figures or elements so you can use the figures with other rules? If you use a 6 cm wide base, then you could use those bases instead of a card or movement tray. In this case, you do not need to use the Blücher base size, and instead use a more standard base size and simply adjust the base widths or distances in the rules. The only minor issue with this is you need to track the unit name and values somehow. If you're using a different base size, then you'll probably need to group the elements together. In this specific case, you'll need to create a unit which is 2 elements wide by about 2 deep. This will work, but it would be easier to place the elements on a movement tray. If you use a movement tray, then why not add a spot for the unit name and a dice spot to track elan, or ammo boxes for artillery. If you're using 4 centimeter wide elements, then a movement tray which looks like this would work rather well. Artillery would slot in perfectly to the same base. There's no need to have a separate artillery and infantry base. Unfortunately for the cavalry, they don't perfectly slot in, but they work regardless. You just have to accept the fact there's going to be a gap to the front and rear. If you have 6mm figures based on 3 centimeter square bases, it becomes a bit more difficult, but not impossible. In my example of how to make trays, I'll use an example which is designed for 3 centimeter squared base 6mm figures. I'm not suggesting this is the best way to move forward. It just so happens to be that the bulk of my 6mm Napoleonics are based this way. I also have 6mm based on different element size, 3 centimeters wide, and 1 centimeter deep for infantry, and that may actually work a little bit better, but let's stick with the 3 centimeter square bases for the moment. While the example I'm going to show is really focused on one type of movement tray, it's important to note it's applicable to any system a player wishes to adopt. So you just simply have to look at your figures, your basing, and work out, using these basic building blocks or the methodology I'll be using, how to create a table which suits yourself. Let's now go through the steps of creating our bespoke movement trays. First, we need to create our movement tray base. In my case, the movement trays are 7 centimeters wide by 8.5 centimeters deep. The edges, which will hold the elements in, are either 3mm or 2.5mm balsa wood. This shows a 2.5mm balsa wood strip, for want of a better word. You will need a cutting board. I use a 3mm MDF sheet, but players can use a professional cutting board if they so desire. The balsa wood is cut with a sharp craft knife. This is a very cheap set I purchased from a dollar shop. You now line up your balsa wood with the movement trays and get your cutting knife ready. You then cut the balsa wood. This shows the balsa wood cut to the correct length. You will need 2 pieces of this length, and once you've cut one, it's pretty easy to do the second one. Make sure they're both pretty much the same size. The final 2 balsa wood strips have to take into account the width of the side pieces of balsa wood. I line up the balsa wood with the width of my movement tray and subtract the width of the side pieces, as you can see here. In this case, you'll need 3 of these balsa wood strips. One of them, 2 to basically sit on the edges, and 1 to divide the dice and the information strip from the figures. You now need 2 very small pieces of balsa wood in order to hold the dice. I cut these using a dice, or the dice I'm going to use, as a guide. We now have all our pieces ready to glue to our movement tray base. Using a good quality PVA glue, place a line along the edges, or the area the balsa wood needs to occupy, as you can see here. I now smear it a bit. The main objective is to avoid any kind of build-up of glue. Place your balsa wood on the glue in the correct position. Avoid any build-up of glue in the tray or the edges of the tray, otherwise the elements may not sit flat into the movement tray, and the dice may also be similar or have a similar problem. Before the glue fully dries, make sure the dice can fit in the dice slots. Also, before the glue dries, make sure, use a ruler to ensure the tray is long enough for your 4 3 centimeter square bases and adjust accordingly. Don't forget the width as well to ensure the bases fit. It should be more than 6 centimeters, and in my case, I generally allow a liberal margin of error in order to make sure the bases fit in correctly. Means that the bases will move around a bit, but it's better to have a little bit too much space than not enough, because when there's not enough, the elements will not fit in at all. This shows the 4 trays which I've placed on a book that's covered with a plastic cover, so none of the glue will stick to it, and it's now ready to dry. To ensure the balsa wood is correctly set, press the balsa wood down and then place a book on top of it very carefully, making sure you don't move it horizontally, otherwise the balsa wood may shift left and right. The objective is to make sure the balsa wood really tightly glues to the base. You can only just see the tray, but this shows the edge of the tray here. Let this dry for 24 hours and you have your trays. After it's dry, this shows 3 unpainted trays. As you'd expect, the PVA glue is now transparent, no longer there, and you can see there's no real lumpy build-up anywhere which could cause the elements to sort of not fit correctly into the tray. These trays are very rough, but I don't really need exact sizes for now. If I had the time, I would make them much more carefully, but as I need about 24 of these trays for a small game, I don't want to take up unnecessary amounts of time doing so. Other players may disagree. If you really sit down and spend a lot of time carefully measuring things, you'll get everything exactly the way you want it, so you won't get gaps, etc. But these trays work, and they work quite adequately. The next step is to paint them. I use a spray paint. First a coat of low-cost green, and then a thin coat of NATO green and a camo spray of NATO brown to give it a bit more of a natural look. Other players may decide a different scheme. Some players I know like flocking the edges or even flocking the whole tray. That's certainly an option, but you have to be very careful if you go down that path. In my case, the colour I use is designed to match my bases, so you do need to select a colour, a spray paint colour, which matches the bases your figures are mounted on. Obviously, if you're going to go to the trouble of actually flocking it, make sure you flock it probably either aligning with the bases of your figures or aligning with your playing area, whatever choice. But when you flock it, be very careful, because you don't want to have a build-up along the edges, which means that you can't place your elements into it. This shows the movement tray with figures and dice in it. The tray has 2 line infantry elements and 2 light infantry elements in skirmish mode in front of it. I mean, the elements inside really are irrelevant for these rules. Just make sure you put something that's nice. If you have 6 centimetre square bases, then you don't have to worry about having 4 separate elements. Now, I have to admit, if you do decide to go down the flocking path for these bases, they do look a lot better. This shows 2 movement trays on a playing area. The playing area is for a different game. In normal circumstances, the built-up areas, woods and hills, would all be the same size as the movement tray. This is an interesting point. The terrain features need to at least be the size of your largest single element. In this case, in my case, it's 7 by 8.5 centimetres. So the terrain pieces and built-up areas should at least be something along those lines, so you can actually fit the whole tray or element into the terrain feature if required. There is an alternative option. An alternative movement tray could look like this, which is 7 centimetres wide by 6.5 centimetres deep, which matches a standard card deck much more closely. I suspect most players would use this configuration if they possess a 6mm force mix designed for BB&B. However, in my case, I went with the 6 centimetre square option because these trays could also be used for other rules, specifically World War II and Cold War micro-armour rules. This shows the trays, or a number of trays, on a playing area. While it certainly does not look as good as a typical figure game, which do not use movement trays specifically, it certainly looks better than the dining room table with cards placed on it. I have to also emphasise, if you did flock your movement trays, it would look significantly better and probably start coming very close to a typical figure game configuration or feel. Another option is to simply purchase 6 centimetre square movement trays, as you can see here. They look okay, there's certainly nothing wrong with it. The only issue is that there's no room for the dice, no room for the little label which indicates what the units or the combat values are on, but it's certainly another option if you don't want to go through the hassle of making your own movement trays. And so we come to an end of episode 33 of my figure gaming hobby series, in this case covering the creation of movement trays for Blücher. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.